Cleopatra. This is the production that became the definition of a runaway movie before the phrase even existed, and it nearly took down an entire Hollywood studio. Filming on Cleopatra began in London in September of 1960, with an initial budget reported somewhere between $2 and $5 million. Then, Elizabeth Taylor almost died. She contracted pneumonia, required an emergency tracheotomy, and the London shoot was abandoned outright. 20th Century Fox restarted the entire production in Rome under director Joseph L. Mankiewicz, which meant rebuilding every set, every costume, and every prop from scratch. By the time the film actually reached theaters in 1963, the combined production and marketing cost had reached roughly $44 million, the equivalent of over $400 million today. Taylor's deal was $1 million plus 10% of the gross, and her total take landed near $7 million. The on-set affair between Taylor and Richard Burton, both married to other people at the time, became a global tabloid story that delayed production further. The film grossed about $57.8 million on first release, technically the highest-grossing movie of 1963, but the costs were so enormous it barely broke even. To stay solvent, Fox sold roughly 260 acres of its Los Angeles backlot. That land is now the office and residential complex called Century City. Studio head Spiros Skouras was forced out, and the film effectively ended the era of the giant historical Hollywood epic. Cleopatra is patient zero for the modern budget disaster. Every story about a runaway production for the next 60 years gets compared to this one. Cutthroat Island. This is the only film in history that holds a Guinness World Record for biggest box office loss, and it took an entire production company down with it. Cutthroat Island had a reported production budget somewhere between $92 and $98 million, with some sources placing it as high as $115. It was directed by Rennie Harlin and starred his then-wife, Gina Davis, as the lead pirate. Multiple male leads dropped out before shooting started. Michael Douglas reportedly refused to be second billed to Davis. The Carolco production company, the indie powerhouse behind Terminator 2 and Total Recall, was already in deep financial trouble and desperately needed a hit. They did not get one. Carolco filed for bankruptcy in November of 1995, 6 weeks before the film even reached theaters. Cutthroat Island grossed about $10 million domestically and $6 million internationally, for a worldwide total near $16 million. Both Harlan and Davis later said publicly that they had begged Carolco to let them out of the project before shooting. The flop effectively ended Gina Davis's run as a leading action star. This is the cleanest example on this list of a movie literally killing its studio mid-production. And because the bankruptcy filing forced everything into the public record, the autopsy is unusually well documented. The Lone Ranger. Disney shut down this production once, brought it back, and still lost more money on it than almost any other movie they have ever made. In August of 2011, the budget for The Lone Ranger had ballooned to roughly $250 million, and Disney halted pre-production entirely. The project only restarted after star Johnny Depp, director Gore Verbinski, and producer Jerry Bruckheimer all agreed to cut their salaries and shrink the budget down to about $215 million. The reduced budget did not hold. Final production costs climbed right back to between $225 and $250 million, with marketing adding another $150 million on top. The film grossed about $260 million worldwide. Disney's chief financial officer, Jay Rasulo, announced a write-down of up to $190 million in fiscal year 2013. Studio president Alan Bergman later confirmed publicly in 2014 that the company had lost roughly the reported amounts on The Lone Ranger and John Carter combined. This is the rare case where you can watch a studio try to course-correct in real time, fail, and still take a 9-figure hit. The Bruckheimer-Depp-Verbinski Pirates team had been Disney's safest bet, which is what made the loss so shocking. Jaws. Most movies that go this far over their original budget become punchlines. This one became the very first summer blockbuster. Steven Spielberg's Jaws started with a budget of about $4 million. By the time it wrapped, the final production cost was reported somewhere between $9 and $12 million depending on the source. The schedule was supposed to be 55 days of shooting, and it stretched to 159 days, running from May through October of 1974. The three animatronic sharks, jointly nicknamed Bruce, were designed for fresh water. In salt water, they corroded constantly. The mechanical failures forced Spielberg to imply the shark rather than show it, which became the film's signature suspense technique. Released June 20th, 1975, it grossed over $470 million worldwide. By the way, if you're liking what you're watching, I make content like this regularly. I'd really appreciate a subscribe. Thanks. Apocalypse Now. Francis Ford Coppola mortgaged his house, his vineyard, and his future earnings to finish a movie that doubled its budget and nearly killed its lead actor. Apocalypse Now began with a budget of about $12 million, financed personally by Coppola after every major Hollywood studio had passed on the project. The shoot was supposed to take 6 weeks in the Philippines. It ran 238 days. 2 months into filming, Typhoon Olga destroyed most of the sets, forcing a 3-month production shutdown in May of 1976. Coppola flew back to San Francisco with 90 hours of rushes and only 8 minutes of usable cut footage. Then it got worse. In March of 1977, lead actor Martin Sheen suffered a heart attack on set at age 36, which he later attributed directly to the stress of the shoot. Marlon Brando arrived dramatically overweight and reportedly unprepared, having refused to read the source novel, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The Philippine military, which had loaned helicopters and pilots for the famous Valkyrie sequence, sometimes pulled them mid-scene to fight an actual ongoing insurgency. Final production cost reached between $25 and $31 million, more than double the original budget. Coppola's loan from United Artists climbed past $10 million during the production. The film finally opened in August of 1979 and grossed about $150 million worldwide. Apocalypse Now is the textbook case of an auteur production, where the chaos on set blurred into the movie itself. The documentary Hearts of Darkness, made by Coppola's wife Eleanor, captured most of it on camera, and is now part of the canon. The Marvels. The first version of this Marvel sequel was budgeted around $130 million. By the time it reached theaters, it had cost almost 3 times that. Directed by Nia DaCosta, with Brie Larson, Tiona Paris, and Iman Vellani as the leads, The Marvels was initially reported in Vanity Fair at a production budget near $130 million. The final cost climbed to between $274 million and $374 million, depending on which industry source you trust. About $100 million of that came from reshoots alone. 4 weeks of reshoots in April of 2023 were brought in to fix storyline coherence, tied to broader Marvel Studios restructuring. Disney's total estimated loss came in between $200 and $300 million. The 13th Warrior. The original budget was $85 million, and then the author of the book showed up and ordered the entire third act reshot. The 13th Warrior, adapted from Michael Crichton's novel, Eaters of the Dead, was directed by die-hard filmmaker John McTiernan and starred Antonio Banderas. The initial budget of about $85 million had already grown past $100 million by the time principal photography wrapped. Then the test screenings went badly. Crichton himself stepped in and directed extensive uncredited reshoots. He replaced the original Graham Revell score with a new one by Jerry Goldsmith, which meant recutting many scenes to match the new music. The final, all-in cost is widely reported between $160 and $200 million, depending on whether marketing is included. The film returned about $61.7 million worldwide. Touchstone Pictures, the Disney label that financed it, took an estimated loss of between $70 and $130 million. The film essentially ended Crichton's career as a hands-on filmmaker. This is the reshoot spiral at its purest, an author taking over the film of his own book, doubling the budget, and still failing. It's also a cautionary tale about giving novelists final cut. Titanic. This production went 75% over its original budget and almost got its director fired, but it became the highest-grossing movie ever made up to that point. James Cameron's Titanic started with a budget between $100 and $110 million. Cameron himself has confirmed the final production cost at approximately $200 million, a 75% overrun. The shooting schedule grew from 138 days to 160. The financial pressure got so bad that 20th Century Fox brought in Paramount Pictures in May of 1996 to share the risk. Paramount contributed $65 million in exchange for domestic distribution rights. Cameron forfeited his $8 million director's fee and his share of initial gross profits to keep the studios from cutting the film down. Fox's then CEO, Peter Chernin, was privately preparing for a $55 million loss. Then, Titanic opened in December of 1997 and eventually grossed $2.264 billion worldwide. This is the opposite outcome of the same budget overrun process. The reason it pays off here and crashes everywhere else on this list is partly the auteur, partly the marketing campaign, and partly the cultural moment. 47 Ronin. Universal pulled this movie away from its first-time director, hired editors to take it over, and the budget still climbed to $225 million. The Keanu Reeves samurai film, directed by commercial filmmaker Carl Rinsch in his feature debut, started with a reported budget of $175 million. After extensive reshoots, the final budget ballooned to roughly $225 million. Universal removed Rinsch from the edit entirely and brought in studio editors to recut the film themselves. Released on Christmas Day of 2013, it opened to under $20 million over the opening weekend. Universal took an estimated loss of between $120 and $175 million. Waterworld. A hurricane sank one of the main sets, and the budget went from $100 million to $175 overnight. Universal's Waterworld started in 1995 with a $100 million budget, the largest in the studio's history at the time. By the middle of 1994, the budget had grown to $135 million. The final production cost landed between $172 and $175 million, and the all-in cost, including marketing, pushed it near $235 million. One of the floating sets, the atoll structure, sank during a Hawaiian storm and had to be rebuilt from scratch. Star Kevin Costner reportedly put $22 million of his own money back into the production to finish it. Shooting at sea created near-constant weather, safety, and continuity problems that extended the schedule by roughly 3 months. Released July 28, 1995, the film grossed about $264 million worldwide. Universal eventually recovered most of the loss through home video, syndication, and a Waterworld stunt show at Universal Studios theme parks, which still runs today. This is the canonical example of why you do not shoot a tentpole on open water. It also shows how home video and theme parks can quietly clean up a theatrical disaster that the box office never would. John Carter. This is the live-action film where a Pixar director kept reshooting like he was still at Pixar, and Disney took a $200 million write-down because of it. John Carter was directed by Andrew Stanton, the Pixar veteran behind Finding Nemo and Wall-E in his live-action debut. The gross production budget was reported at approximately $306.6 million. After a $42.9 million United Kingdom tax rebate, the net production budget came down to around $263.7 million. Marketing added over $100 million on top. Stanton reportedly scrapped and reshot large portions of the film, treating it like a Pixar animation iteration cycle. Released March 9, 2012, it grossed about $184 million worldwide. Disney announced a $200 million write-down within 2 weeks of release. Studio chief Rich Ross resigned in April of 2012, less than 2 months after the film opened. John Carter is the case study for what happens when you let an animation director run a live-action shoot like a CG iteration cycle. Every studio that has hired an animation director for live action since has used this as a reference point. Baron Munchausen. Terry Gilliam's 18th century fantasy was so chaotic on set that the trade press was already writing budget post-mortems while it was still shooting. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen started with a budget of about $20 million in 1987. The final production cost climbed past $46 million by the time it wrapped. Production at Cinecittà Studios in Rome was hit with elephant stampedes, disputed shooting rights, and producer turnover. A Los Angeles Times feature called the production an over-budget nightmare, a full 14 months before the United States release. Gilliam reportedly punched a hole in his own car window during one production standoff. Released in the United States in March of 1989, the film grossed roughly $8 million. This is the European edition of the Runaway production. Same disaster, but with European studio politics and a director famous for fighting the system. Heaven's Gate. This is the movie that gave Runaway Productions their name, and the only one on this list that genuinely ended an entire Hollywood studio's independence. Director Michael Cimino made Heaven's Gate fresh off winning Best Picture and Best Director for The Deer Hunter in 1978. United Artists gave him an initial budget of $11.6 million, and Cimino himself claimed he could deliver the film for $7.5 million. After 6 days of shooting, he was already 5 days behind schedule. He had spent $900,000 and had exactly 1 minute of usable footage to show for it. Cimino's perfectionism became legendary. He insisted on extreme period authenticity, rebuilding a full Wyoming town set and reshooting entire sequences over small inaccuracies. The infamous roller skating sequence reportedly took 5 days and consumed most of a week's budget on its own. Final production costs reached approximately $44 million, nearly 4 times the original. Cimino's original work print ran 5 hours and 25 minutes. He trimmed it down to a 3-hour, 39-minute theatrical cut for the New York premiere on November 19, 1980. The reviews were universally hostile. United Artists pulled the film from theaters within days and re-released a shortened 149-minute cut the following spring. Final domestic theatrical gross of about $3.5 million. Owner Transamerica sold United Artists to MGM the next year, in 1981, ending the studio's 6 decades of operation as an independent. It's worth noting that United Artists was already weakened by executive walkouts and other 1980 flops. But Heaven's Gate was the final blow. The film has been critically reappraised since the early 80s, but the budget story is the angle that defines it. This is the founding myth of the Runaway production. Every conversation about a movie going over budget for the next 40 years circles back to Heaven's Gate. If this was interesting to you, consider subscribing so you catch every new video. Thanks for watching.